Good evening. Welcome to another exciting program of the Queen's Grapevine. Just happen to be your host, Wallingford Lee. Tonight on the Queen's Grapevine, we're going to talk about domestic violence. Domestic violence is a very harmful thing that happened to a lot of, I would say, couples, a lot of married people, and even people who are not married. It can happen in various type of relationship, and it's something that really affects the other person who has been abused. We want to take the opportunity tonight to talk about this sensitive matter that is worldwide, and it has taken a total spread all over the world. For you to understand the signs and plus of domestic violence, and maybe the way out, the one who's doing the domestic violence can get the proper professional help before it's too late, because it happened in a lot of families. Some family oppress it, are in denial. And tonight on the Grapevine, you're going to have the opportunity to know why some women in some cases stay into these domestic violence situations. And you also need to know that domestic violence also happen to men in various cases. So again, it's a mutual type of thing that happen a lot in our community and in the world. We want to take this opportunity to talk about something that is sensitive and very important to us. We have on our program tonight someone who's an expert and have worked in these sensitive areas. I'm talking about Ms. Martha Flores, who has been kind enough to give us the opportunity to be on our program. So it gives us a great deal of pleasure and, of course, satisfaction to have such an important guest as Ms. Flores on our program. Ms. Flores, welcome to our program.
Welcome. How are you? Thank you.
Good. It's good to have you. Can you tell our viewing audience that coming into the program a little bit about your background so they can have a flavor of just exactly who you are and what you've done in the community?
Well, my name is Martha Flores Vasquez. It's kind of like a household name. It's a household name because everybody knows Martha Flores Vasquez as a community leader. I've been a district leader in the 40th Assembly District, which used to be the 22nd Assembly District. I am the founder of Community Prevention Alternatives for Families in Crises. And I have been in the community here in Flushing for 34 years. I've worked at CUNY. I've helped with dissertations on domestic violence for Denise Walden Green in Harlem Hospital. And I continue to do the good work of an advocate for victims of violence. I'm also someone who's helping with many different issues across the board, like housing, nutrition, you name it, everything under the umbrella of empowering women and men to live a better quality of life.
As I stated before, when we opened the program, we talked about the vast amount of strength that she has in the community and also logic. So you just got a little bit, just a small touch of just exactly who my guest is and why it was important for us to get her on the Queen's Grapevine, which happened to be an educational program that's shown in Queens, of course, which happened to be our own base, and also Westchester County and Port of Long Island. Can you tell our viewing audience, what is your interpretation of domestic violence, please?
Domestic violence is something that's learned and passed on from one generation to another. Domestic violence, I would say that the definition of domestic violence involves physical, verbal, emotional abuse. And it can happen in the workplace, it happens in same-sex relationships, it happens with married couples, individuals that are not married, teenagers. It happens across the board, and children learn it, they take it into the community, and that's where you get gang violence.
Well, it's interesting you talk about that, and that's why when we talk about the show, we said it's a sensitive matter. You said it's passed on. What do you mean by that? Children that comes out of a relationship where there's a lot of domestic violence, a lot of fighting, a lot of arguing, and certain physical violence, do they adapt that type of behavior in some cases?
They learn it because our parents are role models, and this is the behavior that they're modeling. And unfortunately, they go to school, they become bullies, and then they pass that on into the community because this is what they're learning at home. For that reason, parents have to be very careful how they conduct themselves in front of children. And actually, domestic violence in front of children is a crime, and you can go to jail for that.
So in other words, it depends on how you carry yourself in front of your child, and that type of outburst and that type of a loud behavior and physical, in some cases, is something that affects the child directly and indirectly, and it also can lead to you being arrested.
Absolutely, because it's considered child abuse.
Very interesting. As we talk about domestic violence, how many different types of domestic violence there are in your interpretation?
Well, one of the things that slip through the cracks all the time is when men are victims of domestic violence. A lot of times I get cases where we think that the male is the perpetrator, and then after 2 or 3 sessions in evaluating and assessing a case, I discover that it is the woman who is battering the husband. And you know, it's unfortunate that males are too shy to speak about it, and that it has to be discovered through good forensic social workers and psychologists, because until then, they keep it a secret, they stay silent, they're frowned upon, and slowly but surely we discover it. But it goes back and forth. We have a lot of advocates for women. I'm an advocate for women, of course. But when you start to continue to do a discovery of the case, you start to find the findings that sometimes the male is a victim as well.
It's very interesting. We're going to break it down a little bit in a piece when we talk about domestic violence. I'm happy you mentioned the men's side because we did a certain amount of survey, and we found that in the United States of America, there were over 600,000 men that were affected by domestic violence, some of them physical, some of them verbal abuse, and in some cases, some of them was actually killed by their spouse or their better half, and some of them were killed, those that were involved into same-sex marriage. So this is something widespread. Why do you think that some men don't come forward with talking about domestic violence, what they're suffering? You think it's an embarrassment or a macho situation?
Well, for the most part, there's a machismo issue going on where they're afraid to talk about it. And when they report it to the police come and they become the advocate for the female. So there's a trend of defending the female and not the male. It goes back and forth. And then you have to do counseling with both partners to ameliorate the situation.
Well, it's very interesting. As I said when we started the program, it's a very sensitive matter and it affects all of us. Now, our review told us that domestic violence mostly affect women. Affect them in various ways. Some women have come through a situation, as you mentioned, as a child, who've experienced domestic violence and feel that it's okay in some cases, in some relationships. And you need to know it's not okay. You're a human being and you have all right. You must not be abused. You should not be abused and should not tolerate it. And there are places to go for help. There's a lot of help. Things have changed today. You have certain rights as a human being and as a woman. You should be treated with a certain amount of respect by your husband or by your better half. You don't have to tolerate it, and you must not put up with it. And there's help out there if you want to continue with this type of relationship where you can seek help for your husband. How widespread is domestic violence in your view?
Well, there's a cultural perspective. I see that you're talking about the cultural, social perspective. And basically, this is a behavior that's viewed throughout different cultures, and it's the norm. And they don't know that they're victims of domestic violence because they think that it's the norm. And until you go to a specialist and it's discussed that this is not healthy, that this is not a good way of life, that you need to empower yourself, you don't discover that this is unacceptable behavior.
Now, let's talk a little bit about prevention, because you work in that area of that. Can you give us a couple of examples of domestic violence of a man who has experienced it and had the nerve or the strength to come to you without mentioning a name? How do you help that person in a situation like that?
How do I help that person? It becomes very difficult to help the male population because they don't want to admit that they have been a victim. They don't want to admit that they have been a victim because they can't believe that they have been a victim. They can't believe that they have been a victim because the female is supposed to be a fragile, feminine creature. But the males have that feminine aspect, especially those who have been nurtured by their mothers and who grew up respecting women. And they know their boundaries and limitations and cannot believe that they have to restrain themselves, which you have to walk away for the most part.
Well, one of the things in our research that we were surprised at, a domestic violence situation we read about, this guy was nurtured by his mom, what do you call like a mama's boy, if this is right that way. But apparently he wasn't strong enough in bed. And the woman that he married was one that demanded a certain amount of sexual pleasure and satisfaction from him. And when he was not able to deliver, she reacted in a very violent way. It was so violent that she broke his arm in one situation. Have you ever seen anything as sensitive of that, or is that surprising to you to find something of that nature?
I've heard of cases that are similar, and one of the situations that I can review back to is a particular male that was hit over the head because he wasn't having sex with the partner. She demanded sex. Jealousy is a major part of domestic violence, and many perpetrators accuse their partners of cheating on them. And she aggressively pursued him sexually, and when males are pursued sexually, they have a tendency to not be able to function. And it became a big problem. So I had to take both of them into session, and I had to work with them in that area. It's a very difficult and delicate area to have to address.
When you address something like that, when you talk about taking both of them in session, do you do it at the beginning separately and then together? How do you put together a session like that?
You have to do individual counseling, you have to do dual counseling with both of them, and then you also have to send them into groups so that they can each get supportive counseling.
And how long a process, well, I know all patients are different, but a process like that is so sensitive, that became so volatile, how long a process like that might take? Take a month, months, weeks?
Well, we try to do it in a 12-week session process, but sometimes it goes into 3 months, 6 months, and then sometimes they have to come back.
Very interesting. We'll be right back in the Queen's Grapevine as we continue talking about domestic violence, the pros, the cons, the sensitive, and the impact. And in some case, the victim can even be killed. We'll be right back on the Grapevine as we continue navigating, talking about domestic violence. And we're back in the second half here of Queen's Grapevine, talking about domestic violence, the danger of it. Our research tells us that there's no single logical way why a man would jump a woman physically, or vice versa, why she would do it or abuse one another. We live in such a dangerous social situation that affect homes. Sometimes unemployment and the frustration that I have at the job lead one partner, one spouse against the other as the bills mount. Some cases is sex, as Ms. Flores mentioned, or as we talked about in the first half of the program. Some is just the pressure of life itself. And in some cases, it's drugs also. Today's youth that are involved into drugs, and you get into a relationship, one do it and one don't, and it leads to all different type of situation that lead into what I would call an abusive relationship that can affect one spouse more than the other, and it becomes like a territorial animal, so to speak. As we continue talking about domestic violence, tell us a bit of some of the trauma that goes through the person who's going through a domestic violence situation.
Well, some of the trauma that they're going to, because first of all, it starts with economics. It's prevalent, domestic violence is prevalent predominantly in relationships, even though it happens across all financial statuses. It happens with families that are in poverty. The arguments over where are we going to get the next dollar to pay the rent, feed, and dress the children. But basically, I think that domestic violence is learned through the family tree. The family tree comes from the great-grandparents to the grandparents to the parents to the children, and is passed on, so on and so forth. Domestic violence is an issue that is social, and for that reason, behaviors have to be modified in front of our children. Domestic violence needs to be abolished, but until we begin to see it as a social behavioral problem, we're not going to eliminate domestic violence.
I am alarmed about the one when you talked about poverty, because I know it's a fact. I'm also alarmed about the fact that it's passed down through the children who see these type of behavior. How do we cure something like that, though?
We cure it by workshops, by support groups, by preventive workshops, workshop series as Community Prevention Alternative has been involved since 2006 and even prior to the foundation. I have worked with City College and communities and throughout Queens County and New York City to promote music against drugs and domestic violence, social activities that bring people together, highlight the issue of domestic violence, to highlight the fact that we need to change society by educating our society. It's a cognitive process. Until we educate all individuals and cultures across the board, preventative measures are important and that we need funding to have those preventative measures to the elected officials, we're not going to be able to reduce these crimes that exist as a result of domestic violence.
About workshops, because obviously workshops are a tremendous education process for the community and for the world out there. But more importantly, let's take a step back. One who's been abusive all his life and his wife are tolerated. How do you get him to a workshop like that? How do you get a person like that to a workshop?
Unfortunately, there has to be an incident or a neighbor to see something, say something. If a neighbor sees something, our model is if you see something, say something, and then we can drop off pamphlets under the door, we can reach out to that person via phone, invite them to a workshop, have creative forums where individuals can come for one thing. Table is there with information, like on May 11 at Flushing Hospital between 4 and 8 p.m. we're going to have a program that's focused on a Mother's Day Anti-Violence Prevention Day. And I think that we need more programs like that. We need funding for more programs like that so that we continue to send out the message that preventive measures are very important so that we can change the cycle of domestic violence.
This workshop that's taking place in Flushing Hospital obviously is going to be something extremely important because Flushing is one of the largest multicultural societies of New York City itself. More of a large multicultural people of all walk of life in the Queens area. Have you given out enough pamphlets or newspaper ad to get a good crowd in Flushing Hospital for this presentation? What is your expectation?
Yes, we expect between 200 to 300 people. We have a robocall message going out to the community. We have volunteers putting out flyers, and we're making individual phone calls to the victims that have been assessed by Community Prevention Alternatives at other forums and other workshops, and they have not followed through with coming to us for help. So continue to do the outreach. Outreach is where we can benefit people, and we will continue to do the good work. Community Prevention Alternatives is here for families in crises.
And one of the things that you also mentioned was funding. How important funding is, and where do you go to get funding for something of a program of this type of magnitude? Because domestic violence affects each and every one of us, the rich, the poor, the middle class. It happened in a lot of families. Again, I started this program by saying that it's somewhat suppressed at times, but do not kid yourself. Verbal abuse is domestic violence. Yelling and screaming at your spouse, your wife, or vice versa, it's a form of abuse and it should not be tolerated. How important funding is, and where do you go for something like that? It would be good if you could take a program of this magnitude all over the tri-state area to educate the mind of couples.
Well, you go to the business community, you go to your elected officials. I know that the State Assembly and the Senate no longer has member items. The Congress no longer has member items. The City Council has member items. But right now there are issues regarding member items and who decides who gets what. I think they need to take a very close look at active organizations such as Community Prevention Alternatives. I also want to add that domestic violence also happens in the workplace. And I think that organizations, businesses, agencies need a workshop on domestic violence so that we can help to have a better functioning society, even in the workplace.
Give us an example of domestic violence in the workplace, a small example if you can.
A small example of domestic violence in the workplace: an individual who's domestically violent in the home takes that into the workplace, takes it out on a co-director, takes it out on staff, and that's where you begin to see that something is going on in the home that that individual is carrying over into the workplace, and is considered abuse.
Isn't HR very important in a case like that? By HR, I mean human resources taking over something that with an incident that happened in the office with an abusive young man against a coworker or a woman. Shouldn't HR be involved in something like that?
Yes, they absolutely need to get involved. As a matter of fact, I handle a lot of different diverse cases where we have social workers that are being affected by individuals who supervise them, who are abusive to them as well. And these behaviors carry over into the workplace. They carry over into the community with children, and we need to prevent these issues.
Very interesting. Well, we'll be right back on the Queen's Grapevine as we continue to move forward talking about the dangers of domestic violence, the steps that you can take. When we get back, we want to talk a little bit about the position of the police department when they are called into a domestic violence situation. We'll be right back on the Grapevine. And we're back here in the Queen's Grapevine talking to Ms. Martha Flores, who has been kind enough to talk to us about domestic violence. Such a sensitive situation. She has the background and the experience, and she has worked with a lot of victims and has been successful in bringing back some of those who have had a lot of emotional problems. She has also been very successful with the aggressor also in giving that person the professional and needy help that they need, and in some case even recommend them to a more advanced program. So like I said, domestic violence is something that's prevalent in our community, that's prevalently in a lot of homes. It doesn't come out sometimes, but it's important to those of you watching a program of this magnitude to know that there's help. There's a hotline for domestic violence in every borough and in every state of New York. And as such, if you think you're into a situation like that, do not hesitate to look for help. Do not wait to be pummeled. Do not wait to be abused. Do not wait to be killed, because domestic violence can lead to almost any and everything in some cases. And again, sometimes it's important to kind of record certain things and play back to that person for them to hear the heavy words and the vulgarity that is expressed to you in front of your own children. Ms. Flores, as we continue talking about domestic violence, walk us through a process where a woman has been abused physically and she called the police department. I want to understand what is the picture, the responsibility of the police department, and the presentation that they have to make when they go to that home in terms of asking the proper questions and in terms of whether they take the aggressor or not take the aggressor.
Well, basically, a lot of times when the police department comes to the home, they have to make an assessment of injury if they see an injury. They cannot make an assessment on domestic violence when it's verbal, but if there's a threat of violence, they have to take it seriously. Police officers are mandated reporters. There are cases where they walk into the home and immediately they have to make a serious decision to remove the children, particularly when there are children there. They have to call a relative to take the children, or they take the children to the police department, because once again, children witnessing domestic violence is a crime. Children witnessing domestic violence is abuse. So they have to make a determination not only based on injury, but based on a threat of violence.
Very interesting. If the police department was called to this home a first time and he didn't arrest anyone, the woman says, no, I don't want you to take him in. And 2 or 3 weeks back, they're called back into the same home, and now you find the children, them screaming, crying, and they're scared. What is the position of the police department then?
The police department, for the most part, and we've come a long way with that because we've educated the police department, we've educated judges. This study started in its advocacy in 1996 with Denise Walden Green in Harlem Hospital. And basically, one of the things that needs to happen is that the police needs to make a determination based on their expertise, which they've been trained in many cases, and they have to make a determination, and on that day, they cannot let these things slip through the cracks, but a lot of times they do. So there has to be an advocate, there has to be a counselor that steps in, such as myself, when I get the phone call, and I take action, and I deploy the police department to do their job.
When you talk about deploy, give us an example when you deploy them.
You have to call them and tell them what the forensics of the case are. You got to give them a background, and you have to tell them, I am a mandated reporter, and I am reporting this, and as a mandated reporter, you get the job done.
Now, in some cases, you know, the public, the newspapers, or the media, which is very volatile and very sensationalized, in some cases newspapers and the television, but they do ask a proper question. Why does some women stay in relationship? They've been beat up once or twice, they've been beat up 2 or 3 times. Why do they stay? Is it because they're not working? Is it because of fear? Or is it because of incompetence? Or is it because it comes natural to them in some case? I'm asking, you know, what happened in a case like that?
In the social cultural perspective, they don't know that they're victims of domestic violence, but for the most part, there are economic reasons, sometimes for the children when there are children involved.
Well, as we stated to you, the domestic violence situation is something that's ongoing. We hope that with a program like this, those of you who have experienced it, if you need the help, you seek the proper help, because there is help out there. And for the victim, there's a hotline, and there are people like this Marta Flores Vasquez who are professionals, okay, who are capable to help you. And as you see, the phone number crossing the line here will give you an opportunity to call a person with her experience to give you the necessary help. In behalf of the family of Grapevine, we want to take this opportunity to tell you thank you so much for being so kind enough to spend the last half an hour with us. Well, like I said, half an hour is not enough, but it gives a little bit of flavor, perspective to those out there watching a program of this magnitude to know that they have help and that things are much better continue to how they used to be. And again, continued success to you.
Thank you.
And thanks for being with us.
Thank you to the audience.
And again, this is Wallingford Lee saying goodnight for the Queen's Grapevine and saying to you, we'll see you next week at the same time at the same place, and hope that this program has been to your liking and, more important, educationally to you. Good night.